Had to leave for a while. We're back now. What did you miss? Well, I was describing... I'll play it again. Describing Nietzsche. So Nietzsche's death of God.
Not suffering itself was the curse that lay over mankind so far.
So we'll talk about suffering as well, but Nietzsche thought that the meaninglessness of suffering was the thing that really hurt us and not the suffering itself. I think he's using the wrong word, but I'll get to that in a minute.
With his proclamation, God is dead, Nietzsche prophesied the coming of an age when the interpretations of life's purpose, which had been dominant up to that point, most prominently the belief in a God, would be unveiled for what they are, mere myths or stories.
Now, the reason that he thought that was that Nietzsche was right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and those changes in the way that people do the world's work were fundamentally changing us as a people, as a human race, as a species. They were fundamentally changing the way that we relate to one another. I could talk for hours about the prevalence and significance of work in human existence, but that changing and the necessity for lots and lots of toil to the disappearance of the necessity of lots and lots of toil changed everything, allowed us the leisure time to think about these big moral questions and come to some clearer answers to them. So this, he thought, the Enlightenment was going to lead to the conclusion that God, the concept of God, in order to explain things in nature and in order to give us a sense of purpose, were discredited and obsolete. We could argue whether or not that happened. There are ways in which I don't think it did, but let's assume that it did.
Without the conviction that life has a purpose or goal, Nietzsche understood that many individuals would fall into despair under the suspicion that we are nothing but meaningless animals in a meaningless universe. Nietzsche discerned that this dark suspicion would usher in a state of nihilism, which is the belief that everything lacks meaning. Without a goal or purpose to impose meaning on one's suffering, one is left with the despair-ridden conviction that one suffers for no reason at all.
Okay, so that didn't happen. What is this modernity you mentioned? Post-industrial life. Anything beyond, anything past the Industrial Revolution, I call modernity. And the idea that the removal of a sense of purpose didn't happen. It can't happen. It's not going to happen because people are naturally driven to strive for the good life. Not moment-to-moment periods of happiness or long stretches of periods of contentment, but a whole good life well lived. We are innately driven to seek that. And to be able to look back and say at the end of our life that our life was good, that is the ultimate purpose of our lives, innately. It's why we do everything that we do. But so I think what he was describing here was kind of impossible. But the interesting thing to tease out of this is to look at the 21st century and to look at 2021 and to realize this didn't happen. People didn't lose a sense of meaning. They didn't even lose their absolutist moral convictions. We simply, as I had said earlier, we took the conclusions of a sort of Christianish morality that we have in, especially in the West and the East. You know, Islam is one of the three Abrahamic religions, and we demythologized them. We got rid of the theological scaffolding that underpinned those conclusions. And we didn't exactly replace them with secularism and science and humanism. We just kind of assumed that those things would provide answers at some point to the question of why these absolutes exist and how they can exist. And the peculiar characteristic of that is the fact that we still assert that these moral truths are real truths and the moral absolutes are real absolutes. We acknowledge them, but we can't explain them. And by this, I don't mean that there aren't people who say that there is no such thing as moral absolutes and that morality is relative. I don't mean to say that there are indeed those people. I think as a society, we're definitely not there. We are definitely still in the moral absolutist camp as a society as a whole. So the obsolescence of the concept of God, I think, is overstated. I don't think that we killed God. I think we got bored of him. And I think that we got this idea that we, rather than having stabbed God to death, I think we simply accused him of being an underachiever and started to say that our own technical proficiency could kind of fill in those gaps where the more theological, supernatural, sort of biblical explanations and underpinnings of these things lacked technical proficiency, which is a little bit silly if you think about it. Religiosity among people in society does seem to be falling quite recently. That is, people who claim a religious affiliation, a group that is called the nuns, people who don't claim any religious affiliation. We don't know if they're atheists per se, but they just don't claim a religious affiliation. That number has increased, but there's a really good book by a person named Ross Douthat called The Decadent Society. Not The Decadent Society, I'm sorry. He talks a little bit about this and that, but what in the world was the book called? I've been reading The Decadent Society, so now that's foremost in my mind. It wasn't Bad Religion. It was, it had to do with the America's Real Religious Center, which he thought was sort of a mean between Oprah Winfrey on one hand and Jordan Peterson on the other hand. These being religious, our substitute is a little too strong, but I'll use it anyway. Our substitute for religious figures have now boiled down to figures like Oprah and Jordan Peterson and that sort of thing. And TED Talks. He said that TED Talks was a sort of preachy-esque revivalism. What do you mean when you say we can't explain moral absolutes? Well, so when we espouse human rights, universal human rights, the people who normally advocate for civil rights under the auspice of human rights are doing nothing different than a preacher in 1958 or even 1888 would have done, saying that we are all equal because we're all created by God, and that it's our love of each other through God that we need to recognize, that we're sort of divinely commanded to recognize. Rather than say that, they simply strip away all that stuff that I just said about God and leave the we're all equal part, but without putting any new scaffolding in its place. So the moral absolutism and moral realism cannot be argued it would be weird to say secularly, because it can't be argued materially. There are no facts in the world that point us to universal human rights. There are facts about human nature that point to universal human rights. But there are no facts in the world that can do that. And this sort of hard Darwinian view of nature is it can't really get us there. And this is the thing, make no mistake, this is the thing that we are sort of trying to substitute under the auspice of secular humanism. We're trying to substitute for theology. I don't mean that science is a religion. It's not. I mean that people's, for lack of a better word, no pun intended, faith in science as a sort of final arbiter of truth is a substitute for religion. We need a sort of clerical function for something like that, I think. Maybe instead of spiritual, I could say immaterial. In order for moral realism to be true, there has to be some immaterial character to human beings and to life. You once said that morality is based on oughts. Is that what you're missing from these people? Well, they've got the oughts. They just can't explain how they reach them. Look, we ought to, for example, and this is an issue that I very strongly advocate for. Trans rights. We ought to remove the possibility of discrimination for trans people. They should be visible. They shouldn't be discriminated against in employment, housing, even in social. So we ought to help them and be accepting of them. And we ought to do that because every citizen has the right to make a good life for themselves through their own efforts, and if they're being actively, societally discriminated against, that right is infringed. So that ought, in the so in the secular sense, a non-religious sense, we can, and I think should argue for human rights in the way that I just described, in an overall Aristotelian sense of equality by nature, that nobody is more or less human, and everybody has a right to make a good life for themselves through their own efforts. That's a rational principle. But it involves recognition that we are intellectual beings and not instinctive animals. That it involves recognition that there's something radically different about human beings as opposed to their sort of brute animal counterparts in the world. Their animal societies and human societies are fundamentally different. And the funny thing is that it's the overtly religious people, the creationists and the sort of right-wing conservative Christianity that's trying to appropriate naturalism and philosophical materialism. If you think about the arguments of biological essentialism, boys have a penis, girls have a vagina, and so that's what man and woman means, and we can't change that because then everybody gets confused and that sort of thing. That's a materialist argument. They would call it natural law, but it is nevertheless a materialist argument. It reduces human beings to instinctive brute animals. If you ask somebody, why should we not expand the category of women to include trans women? part of their argument will inevitably be, well, we're biologically driven to do this, that, and the other thing, as if we were instinctive the way that non-human animals are, which we're not, and which they affirm in all of their sermons when they're talking about God, and when they're talking about a relationship with God and the kind of beings that we are spiritually. They affirm that, but they deny it when it suits them, when they're trying to make political arguments to keep their own status quo going. Well, I've gotten way off topic here, but that's kind of what I mean when I say morality is based on oughts. Yes, we have to only human beings make ought statements. Maybe this would be a good illustration. The distinction between two kinds of associations in human society. So, in one in human society and one in another kind of animal society. So, going back to the issue of rights, using the issue of trans people, trans rights as a example, and gender. We'll just talk about gender in general, because this sort of deconstructive reanalysis of gender and what it is and where it comes from is very prevalent today. So I'll use that as an example of how we arrive at oughts. So we examine two different associations in two different animal communities. One is the example of a beehive. Bees are instinctively driven to create beehives. They come into this world with instinctive drives to do that. They don't sit down in a committee and hammer out different ideas for how best to maximize their societies. They simply do because they're driven to do it through instinct. So that's one form of association. Now think of another form of association between beings. A football team. Okay. Whatever your favorite football team is, if you like football. A sports team. Human beings aren't instinctively driven to make sports teams. The beehive, because it involves nothing other than natural drives, natural instincts, that aren't consciously being directed by bees. The bees are being directed by their own instincts. The beehive is natural. That association, that association between them is natural. That form of association. A football team, we aren't instinctively driven to create football teams. So would we say that a football team is artificial? No, that doesn't really sound right, does it? A football team is conventional as opposed to natural. It's a convention of human society. It's a convention of association between people. Now, think about the concept of the family in human society. I don't just mean your children. I mean lines of kinship, the house of Moog, something like that. Familial inheritance relationships and that sort of thing. And families and people who get together and couple and have children in order to share their lives together and have this experience together. Is that natural or conventional? Ooh, that's a toughie, isn't it? The peculiar characteristic of the family is that it is both natural and conventional. We are naturally driven, although not instinctively. We plan families. We have sexual ethics, that sort of thing. So we're not instinctively driven to procreate and mate the way that bees are instinctively driven. They cannot do otherwise. But we do have biological impulses and drives to procreate. So that part is natural. The institutional form of the family is conventional. It's for a higher purpose, the purpose of consolidating wealth, consolidating attention, consolidating our efforts to raise children, that sort of thing. So it's both natural and conventional. So now that we have these concepts, natural, conventional, and both, okay, we can analyze the issue of gender. I'm glad you're still here, video games. We can analyze the issue of gender and ask the same question, and we come to the same answer. Gender is both natural and conventional. Okay, this is where people get really confused and really screwed up, and you know, I get confused about it. It's perfectly natural to get confused about it because it's a very complicated issue. Like the family, the institution of the family, the institution of gender, and it is an institution, by the way. Not talking about biological sex now, we're talking about gender. Gender is an institution. There are no women in lion societies. Right? Gender, we do have biological constitutions that are naturally set up for our reproductive roles. Boys have a penis, girls have a vagina. That's true. There are a male and female in every species, or at least most species. There are asexual species, but for the most part, there are male and female, especially among mammals, I think. There are male and female in every species. There are a reproductive roles that play into reproduction. So in that sense, gender is natural. There is nothing in nature that says that men don't shave their legs, but women do. Men wear these kinds of clothes, women wear these kinds of clothes. Wearing these kinds of clothes is effeminate, that sort of thing. Those are conventional. Those are like the football team. So gender is both natural and conventional. So what does that mean? That means that the conventional aspect of gender, which is almost always what we're talking about when we talk about gender, we're usually just talking about social norms. It means that those things are subject to change. And I don't even mean direct activist change. I mean, they have changed naturally over the course of human history. Men in different societies used to wear skirts. It used to be that women weren't supposed to wear pants. Those sorts of things. So these gender norms have changed through osmosis throughout history. So and the observation that gender is conventional in its norms means that change is not a violation of any kind of natural law or something like that. And our gender norms are not laws in that sense. So to tie this back into the issue of what's on the screen, God, I get the distinction you're making between biological sex and gender conventions. A lot of people seem to confuse these two. It is confusing because we're used to, especially in this culture, especially in the culture that is a sort of post-Nietzschean deal, where we've abandoned the concept of God as as having any kind of explanatory power and put very little in its place. When I say God, I don't mean this person that you're looking at on the screen. I kind of mean the supernatural, right? But having abandoned the concept of God for naturalism and science and secular humanism, you see the problem. That point of view can't offer us the conventional aspect that I described of human society. It can acknowledge it, but it can't explain it. there is no fact of nature that would say that human societies are any different based on our biological constitution than any other animal society. But it is different, and we can see that it's different, and we need to offer some kind of explanation for that. And secular humanism and science, they don't have those. There is nothing in science that can posit the immaterial. They can posit the undiscovered. They can infer that there must be some quality of the human brain that we haven't discovered yet, that will, once we do discover it and have a better understanding of the brain, that will understand why we can be conventional as opposed to purely natural. They can offer that as a promise for the future, but they can't give any answers. And I don't mean to say, by the way, lest anyone misunderstand me, I don't mean to say that like something like the Bible can give us answers either. The immateriality of the human intellect is something that is roundly denied today, and I think that's a mistake for exactly the reasons I've been explaining over the last half hour. We have to have a explanation for why this is the case that kind of transcends our own biology. Left to our own devices, left to our brains, left to how we are biologically constituted, we would be no different than other animals. There are people who argue that we're not, and that this is delusional behavior or something like that. Well, I could get into that, but most people today, I think, continue to, and this is where Nietzsche got it, I think, wrong. People didn't fall into despair and they didn't say, oh my, if there's no God, then life has no meaning. Why would I go on living? Why not just commit suicide? We didn't say that. We just went, okay, I guess science will figure it out someday. Let me go back to my factories and video games and life, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way, except we replaced one faith for another. And again, I'm not saying science is a religion, it's not, but we replaced faith in God with a faith in our, not just science, but in the technocracy. We replaced faith in God with a faith in our technical ability to make ourselves and our lives comfortable. And this, I think, is another aspect of Nietzsche's thinking, where it's so funny, these people in the 1800s, Karl Marx as well. Marx predicted that a cycle of depressions would cause capital to collapse under its own weight, and he didn't see that we could have internal mechanisms and institutional mechanisms to correct for the boom and bust cycle. Nietzsche thought that abandoning or choosing to see this supernaturalism as being obsolete would cause people to collapse under their own nihilism. And he didn't understand that we have our own internal regulating mechanisms for that, which is the fact that the ultimate end of a human life is the good life. There will always be present a sense of meaning, because life does have meaning. Life does have purpose. We feel that because we're driven to it by virtue of the fact that we're human beings. If I were to ask you, why do you want to have good health? You might say, well, because being healthy allows me to do the kinds of things that I want to do. If I were to ask, well, why do you want to do those things? Why do you want to go to work? Why do you want to make money? You might say, well, because making money would allow me to have a place to live, creature comforts, a TV, all these things, video game consoles, computer. So, well, why do you want to have those things? On and on and on and on. Eventually, we would get to a point where you would say, because I want to live a good life. But if I were to ask you, why do you want to live a good life? The only answer that you could give is, because I want to live a good life. The good life is something, you remember this speech. Yes, the good life is something that we pursue for its own sake. We don't choose to pursue it for its own sake. We do pursue it for its own sake. It's an intellectual human drive, not an instinctive one like the bees creating a beehive. It's an intellectual human drive. It's part of our nature as beings that we pursue this. Our sense of purpose isn't predicated upon beliefs. That's a separate category of things that we have. Beliefs. Our sense of purpose is predicated upon our striving to live a good life. There is no other purpose in life. Ultimate purpose. Everything else is a means to that end. Let's listen to this synopsis of Nietzsche a little bit more.
Nihilism appears at that point, not that the displeasure of existence has become greater than before, but because one has come to mistrust any meaning in suffering, indeed in existence. It now seems as if there is no meaning at all in existence, as if everything were in vain.
See, that simply didn't happen because our overarching beliefs did not diminish that formula that I just gave you. Karl Marx supposed that when the proletariat assumed control of the means of production, that the political institutions in society would cease to be political institutions. Because he thought that political institutions were just what did he call it? A committee to manage the affairs of the bourgeoisie, the affairs of the wealthy, the affairs of the people who own capital. And he said that the political nature of government would liquidate itself if there was proletarian control of the government. That's impossible. Man is a political animal. You will never find a society of human beings without political institutions of some kind. That his prophecy about the liquidation of the political character of political institutions was literally impossible. Likewise, Nietzsche's prophecy that man, when he stopped believing in God and the supernatural, would feel purposeless and empty is an impossibility. It's so fun, but it seemed so imminent because our lives were changing so radically, and I think that people mistook the ability and propensity for institutions of science to make our lives safer and more comfortable. I think they mistook that for science being able to make our lives better. Now, being safer, healthier, and more comfortable are certainly good things. But what have these institutions of science and secularism actually resolved? What problem in the human spirit, in human interactions, have those things resolved? Nothing. They've resolved nothing. If you look at the state of society today, have secularism and secular humanism and science diminished the racial tensions that we have in the United States? Not a bit. That was done through ostensibly religious people. people who could effectively appeal to our common humanity. Has it solved any of our socio-political problems? No. It's just interesting that the inefficacy, the total inability for the institutions that we now substitute for formerly religious institutions to actually give us any of these answers. Let's continue.
Although Nietzsche himself struggled with nihilism throughout his life, he didn't believe life was devoid of meaning. Instead, he came to realize that nihilism is a consequence of the misguided attempt to acquire objective knowledge, or in other words, the desire for there to be an objective meaning to life that an individual can come to know. Nietzsche believed that not only was there no objective meaning to life, but he claimed that truth does not exist, and therefore objective knowledge about anything, including the meaning of life, is an impossibility.
I wonder if he thought that was a true statement, that truth doesn't exist. I think he addressed that, but I'm not sure what he would have said about it. Chris, I'm with Adler on truth. So am I, and I think I think he gave us the clearest answers to that, or rather, Aristotle did, and then Adler wrote all the footnotes on Aristotle. Somebody said, somebody once said that the history of philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, and then Adler said that Aristotle wrote all the footnotes, and then I think Adler wrote all the footnotes on Aristotle. So it goes back in that progression. So the issue here. Nihilism is the result of the misguided desire for there to be an objective meaning to life. Well, as I've just said, there is a objective meaning to life, whether we make it up or not. Whether we like the problem is that we conceive of this as goals, right? So that we conceive of this as, in my life, I want to make a lot of money, or I want to have grandchildren, or I want to have this, that, or the other thing. We don't recognize anymore, because we've lost our basic philosophical concept in this culture. All of those things are means to an end. That end is something that we're striving for, whether we are aware of it or not. We don't realize that we're striving for the good life. Not having a good life now, but being able to say that our whole life was a good life at the end of it. That is the objective meaning to life. When I say objective, I mean something that we aren't consciously choosing, something that isn't just a preference, something that is innate to us. There is an objective meaning to life. The good life is the objective meaning to life. And that's what we will always strive for, whether or not we believe in God.
Instead, according to Nietzsche, an individual is always confined to know the world through one's own personal interpretation of it. The task of painting the picture of life, however often poets and philosophers may pose it, is nonetheless senseless. Even under the hands of the greatest painter-thinkers, all that has ever eventuated is pictures and miniatures out of one life, namely their own, and nothing else is even possible.
So the problem with something like that, is that if that were the case, Nietzsche couldn't possibly have thought that he was meaningfully articulating anything to anybody else. Hold on 1 second. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So I think I've covered that. There is an objective meaning to life that it's apparent to us by virtue of the fact that we're awake. Just awake and not even trying to answer any questions.
Since one cannot escape from one's own personal interpretation or perspective of life, Nietzsche
yeah, we can. Oh, maybe I'll get to that.
Understood that one should give up trying to search for the truth, as there is no truth, and instead paint a picture, or in other words, interpret existence in a way that is life-promoting.
Why? Why? Why should it be life-promoting? If he's saying that it ought to be life-promoting, then he's valuing life as a natural end, a natural end to be sought. And if that's true, that's independent of people's preferences. How interesting.
For in doing so, one will be able to escape nihilism by creating meaning in one's own life. Since Nietzsche realized that the deepest question which confronts man is why do I suffer, he understood the desperate need to first and foremost interpret suffering in a manner which would be life-promoting. Through his analysis of his own suffering, Nietzsche came to understand that pain is not considered an objection to life. Instead, Nietzsche believed that a life without suffering and pain would be a miserable life, for he believed suffering to be a precondition of greatness. You want, if possible,
Greatness.
and there is no more insane, if possible, to abolish suffering, and we? It really seems that we would rather have it higher and worse than ever. The discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far?
Okay. So, he's using the wrong word. Suffering isn't something that we want. Suffering is a, what would you say? Suffering is a debilitating condition that doesn't instruct. Suffering is something that you want to get away from. Suffering isn't the thing that we learn from. I understand what he's saying, but he's using the wrong word. What we need in life is adversity. We need something to push against. We need something to spar with. So he's right when he's. I understand kind of what he's driving at. A life without adversity would be we would just sit here and not develop. We wouldn't be able to test ourselves against anything. That's true, but I don't think that's suffering. I think suffering is the wrong word. I don't know, Chris says, I don't know what that means to have a life without misery or suffering. Yeah, nobody does. But misery and suffering are not things that we... Those aren't the things... Those aren't the sparring partners through which we better ourselves. Those are things that we do, of course, want to alleviate. And in a lot of ways, in the modern world, we've eliminated suffering... across the board. Our lives are, as I've said, a lot more comfortable and pleasant today than they were 100 years ago. One of the things that we've eliminated to the umpteenth degree is toil. These are good things. These are things that we don't want to be living with. Have not eliminated adversity. Adversity is still very much alive, and it always will be, because people are dynamic and we don't always get along, and we have to find ways of doing just that.
With the knowledge that with great suffering comes great advancement, Nietzsche understood that the higher man would be in need of an ideal or a vision of perfection to keep him motivated in his quest for greatness even in his darkest hours. Nietzsche invented the overman as such an ideal. I teach you the overman. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him?
By the way, my understanding is that this stuff was like the biggest inspiration to Jordan Peterson, and if you listen to anything other than his reactionary anti-left stuff, if you listen to his actual thoughts and read his actual books before he became known, it's pretty clear he was inspired by Nietzsche, and I think that's one of the causes of what I perceive to be his foolishness.
The overman as an ideal is a perfect and powerful being, one who has overcome all his inner fears, weaknesses, and deficiencies, and thus one who soars above the rest of mankind. So,
people may be familiar with my belief in character ethics. So some of this, when properly described, is fine. I don't think there's such a thing as an overman. I don't think that people who have self-actualized are better than other people. I think they're on a different rung of a journey that we all go through in life. This, by the way, is inevitable. The overcoming of one's fears, the overcoming of one's adversities, and the learning through adversity, that's something that happens just by virtue of the fact that I had a client once who was in the military. When I say client, I mean when I worked in healthcare and I took care of basically the World War II generation. She was a lieutenant in the Navy. And she told me once, she said, well, they make you a lieutenant just for living there. On planet Earth, this overman concept, you get in life, and I can tell you, being a 40-year-old man, having lived on this planet for way more decades than I'm comfortable saying, that you become an overman just by living here. You really do. It is impossible to go through a long period of life in this world without overcoming these things. This is why old people, the wisdom of the old, like me, is inevitable.
Since ideals can be approached but never realized on this earth,
because that happens through experience. It doesn't happen through will. It happens through experience. It happens through our insights that we gain through exposure to this human life.
Nietzsche maintained that never yet has there been an overman. The best one can hope for is to attain the perfection and power of the overman in rapturous moments.
So, never has there been an overman. I don't think that overmen is a thing. I don't think it's anything that we should aspire to, the way that he is describing it. But it's useful when we talk about happiness as a whole good life well lived to realize that this isn't happiness in the final sense. Happiness as an end to be served by all of our means is not something that we experience in this life. Only the person eulogizing you at your funeral can say whether or not you were happy in life. That's a hard thing to wrap your mind around. You don't experience it here. You don't experience, if you're watching a football game, you don't know if it's a good game until the game is over. The only thing that you can say during the game is that it's becoming a good game or a bad game. But you can't say whether or not it was a good game until it's been completed. Until it exists as a whole. Finished.
Yet it is impossible to maintain this perfection. And after these ecstatic moments, one must always revert back to being human, all too human. In his state as human, all too human, Nietzsche understood that the higher man would become aware of his deficiencies and weaknesses, and would subsequently feel ashamed at the vast gulf which separates him from the perfection of the overman.
I see, this is so weird. It's just a really weird way of putting it. Your fears and weaknesses are a result of your inexperience for the most part. When you first start a job, you're not going to be automatically intuitively great at that job. There's a learning curve that we need to go through with the assistance of other people. It's the same for life. This is why we have parents. This is why we have role models. This is why we have people that we look up to and people that we model and emulate. This is so weird to think that we're just like by ourselves thinking I'm weak and I'm insecure and I have this fear and despair because I look within myself and see that I'm not like perfect. I don't know. It's so bizarre.
Craving the unattainable perfection of the overman, the higher man would begin to hate his imperfect self.
I don't think we crave the perfection of the overman. I think that we and I don't think that causes I think we crave a perfection of a sort. We see in other people, in our role models, the kinds of people that we would like to be. We acknowledge that we are not yet those people, and so we model those people to try and become the people that we do want to be. This isn't an inward-looking process. We don't look inwardly to figure out who we want to be. We look to our mothers, fathers, teachers, grandfathers, moral preceptors, I don't know. We don't do this.
This self-hate, Nietzsche paradoxically held, would be the beginning of the higher man's great love for himself. For the higher man would soon come to realize that without his inner deficiencies and his hatred of them, he would have no motivation to grow and overcome himself.
That's not where growth comes from. That's not where our motivation to grow comes from. Our motivation to grow comes from, as I said, looking at other people and seeing how they live and admiring them and trying to be like them. So.
And thus would remain forever stagnant. I love the great despisers because they are the great revelers and arrows of longing for the other shore. In the section titled On the Vision and the
Okay. Let me I don't know. Is there anything else? I think I've kind of covered the majority of Nietzsche, however you pronounce its protestations that modernity and the Enlightenment would render the concept of God moot. And when the concept of God was rendered moot, we would all go, "Oh, what am I gonna do? Oh, so not. Oh, I gotta commit to. There's no meaning in anything," and that why that's impossible, and why we didn't do that, and why we slid instead into boredom and mediocrity and comfort and nation states and video games and things that, having never lost the intrinsic objective meaning that we perceive to our lives, which is making a good life. Yeah, I think I got it.